Now that we've talked about the organization of living things, let's talk about what makes a living thing living, or in other words, what are the functions that a living thing has to carry out in order to be a living thing. Let's say that we have a picture here of a living thing, or in this case a number of living things. This is actually a picture of my family. But we have a number of living things here. What functions do these living things have to carry out in order to continue living? How do we know that, for example, me there in the middle, how do we know that I am a living thing and my tie that I'm wearing is not a living thing, or the shirt I'm wearing is no longer a living thing? What functions am I carrying out in order to be considered a living thing? I want you to pause the recording, and I want you to take a minute, and I want you to list as many functions as you can think of, and then once you do that, restart the recording and let's talk about what you came up with. Okay, hopefully you came up with a good list of things that are functions of living things. Let me put down a few that often are put down by students, and then we'll talk about some of the functions of living things. Things that often students will talk about when they're talking about necessary life functions. Talk about breathing. Okay, eating is another one that they'll bring up. Growing. You may have put movement. You may have had some other things as well, but let's take a look at these things first. Breathing. So breathing is a necessary life function, but I want you to think a little bit, if you put this, I want you to think a little bit more deeply. Why do we have to breathe? Fundamentally, why? So we know that we're moving air in and out. What does that lead to? Why do we need that air? And then you may say, okay, so we're breathing because we need oxygen. So why do we need it? Why do we need oxygen? Why is that something that living things require? What about eating? So living things have to eat. Why do we have to eat? What are we trying to gain from that eating? Let me show you a list, and this is a list you'll recognize hopefully from your chapter. Let me put our picture of our living things back up here again. That list we had before, breathing, eating, growing, movement, those can fit into these categories you see here. Breathing fit into this list of necessary life functions. One of the places that breathing fits in is going to be in metabolism. What metabolism is it's all the chemical reactions that occur within the body. Now, breathing itself is not a metabolic function, but what breathing does is it brings in oxygen. Oxygen is required for metabolism to happen. One of the major functions of metabolism, one of the major processes of metabolism is what we call cellular respiration, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the semester. But basically, what is happening in cellular respiration, it's very similar to combustion engine. Our body is taking in oxygen and then also food, and using that oxygen and food, we're basically burning it in order to produce energy in the form of ATP. And so that energy is the end product of breathing, and it's also the end product of eating as well. So we can put metabolism, we can put eating in here, because the reason we eat is in order to produce energy that is going to allow us to do many of these other life functions. So eating comes under metabolism. I think you could also put it under digestion. We don't necessarily eat to digest, but in order to eat, we have to be able to digest. So when we take food into our body, we have to be able to break it down into smaller components, because in the form it is when we eat it, it's not ready and it's not available for us to use to carry out our life processes. We have to be able to digest that. And then also that energy, that eating and breathing, allow us to produce movement as well. So that as we eat and breathe and break that down to produce ATP, to produce energy, that allows us to do movement. It also allows us to do basically everything here on this list. Every function of our body requires energy, and we get that from eating and breathing. You notice you'll see growth is up here as well. That is a necessary life function. We have to be able to grow and develop, and also be able to reproduce. These two go together somewhat, but they're both necessary. We have to be able to ourselves grow, but then also perpetuate the species as well. Excretion is important. If we digest, we also have to be able to excrete the waste, because there's parts of the foods that we eat that are not things that we need. They're not things that we can use, and so we have to be able to get rid of those. There's two other ones I want to talk a little bit about, and that's maintaining boundaries here, and also responsiveness. These are important life functions. Maintaining boundaries. So you might say, well, why is that important? Why is that a necessary life function? If we were not able to separate ourselves from the environment, we could not be a living thing. For example, I'm going to write up a term here that we're going to talk a little bit more about here in a minute, but this term is homeostasis. If you think about the environment around us, the conditions that we live in are very different than the conditions that are required for us to be a living thing. For example, think about the temperature. I'm not sure where you are right now. If you're in Sierra Vista like I am, if I go out during the day, the temperature may go down. It's winter right now, so it may go down from 40 degrees, 30 degrees at night, and then it's getting up into the 60s, almost 70s during the day. That's a wide range of temperatures. That's 30, maybe 40 degrees on a given day, and that continues throughout the year. Then think about your body. If you were to take your temperature any time throughout the day, doesn't matter whether it's day, whether it's morning, whether it's night, any time of the day, that temperature is going to stay within just a few degrees. You may be fighting a cold or something like that and have a slight fever, but even when you have a fever, your body temperature can't rise more than a few degrees, or you're going to start having problems. If it gets up too high, then you're going to have to go to see the doctor, go into the ER, or you may even, if it gets a little even higher than that, it may lead to death. And so our body itself has a very small range of temperatures that we can survive in, we have to maintain, that is very different than the environment. Also the molecules, the atoms that make us up. If you were to look at the abundant molecules, abundant atoms in the world, they're different than what is most abundant inside our body. We're mostly oxygen, hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and then a few other just little bits and pieces of other atoms and molecules. If you look at the world as a whole, those major elements are a lot different. There's a lot more iron in the world, etc., etc. So we have to be able to keep a constant environment inside our body in order to be a living thing, and that's different than the outside. And so we have to be able to maintain a boundary. We have to be able to create this barrier so that we can maintain the inside different than the outside. This is the idea behind this term homeostasis. That's what homeostasis means. It's maintaining some sort of balance, maintaining some sort of equilibrium. In order to do this, though, we also have to be able to respond to the environment. Responsiveness is very important, and to be able to maintain those boundaries and to stay in the conditions we need to be living, we have to be able to respond to our environment. Again, our environment is constantly changing. As the temperature starts to rise, we have to be able to, as a living thing, recognize that and make adjustments. So as our body starts to heat up, we respond by sweating, or if our body starts to get too cold, we respond by shivering. So as a living thing, we're able to respond to those environmental changes in order to maintain homeostasis. One other interesting one here is movement. Movement is a requirement of a living thing. Things have to be able to move. Why do we need to move? So the main reason we need to be able to move is in order to get the energy that we need. In the case of humans, we have to go out and find our food. We have to be able to move. We have to be able to move to ingest that food. We have to be able to move to be able to go find the food. Also responsiveness. So if we're in a situation that is not allowing us to maintain homeostasis, we need to be able to move to get out of that situation and find a situation more conducive to maintaining homeostasis. All living things move. Some students often say, well, what about plants? Do plants move? Well, yes, they do. They are stationary, they can't get up and walk around. But if you were to watch a movie or a video, a time-lapse video of a plant, you'll see that they do move a lot in order to adjust where the light, where their leaves are positioned, so they can receive the most sunlight, or other things like that. Especially as the plant is growing as well, it's going to be able to move, and so that is also important life function. So in order to be a living thing, we need to be able to carry out these functions. And I'll point out at this point, there are also what we'd call survival needs. So in order to survive, there are certain things that we need, and these are nutrients, oxygen, water, stable body temperature, and a stable or a certain atmospheric pressure. These are required for us to be a living thing. If we have an imbalance in any of these things, we're going to have problems maintaining homeostasis, and that eventually could lead to death. Point out as well here that we are mostly made up of water. Take a look at how much water is in our body, 60 to 80%. And this again is true of all living things. It varies between living thing to living thing. It can go anywhere between 60 to 90, almost 100% water. If you think about, for example, a jellyfish, over 90% water. But as a human, we maintain, throughout our lifetime, it fluctuates a little bit, but we're somewhere between 60 to 80% water throughout our lifetime. Since we're on this topic, let's jump down and look a little bit about what homeostasis is. So again, homeostasis is this ability that we have to maintain some sort of stable environment, some sort of condition that allows us to live. Every day as we're going throughout the day, we're receiving these impulses from our environment that our body has to respond to in order to stay in some sort of homeostatic balance. If our body gets out of balance, then we're going to be either fighting a disease, we're going to be sick, there's going to be problems associated with getting out of homeostatic balance. And so again, as we go through the semester here and we're looking at all the different systems of the body, keep in mind how that system helps us maintain homeostasis, and then also think about what happens when that system gets out of homeostasis. For example, the first system we'll talk about is integumentary system, basically our skin. Our skin has to maintain homeostasis, has to maintain this balance. If it gets out of balance, we may have some skin disease, we may have skin cancer. There's something going on, and it's never going to be a good thing when our body gets out of homeostasis. So how does our body maintain homeostasis? The way it does this is through a feedback mechanism. So let's say we can represent this by this balance here. Again, our body is trying to maintain this sort of balance. This is homeostasis. If our body goes out of balance, either up or down, then our body is going to recognize that because we're responsive. So we have systems set up in our body to recognize that stimulus coming in and saying, "Whoop, your body's out of balance. Your body's starting to heat up. It's getting too hot. You're no longer 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit." So what happens next is that our receptors are going to recognize that imbalance, and it's going to send a message to our control center. In our case, generally that's going to be the brain. And there are instances when the spinal cord works as the control center, or there's other ways it can work. But basically, we're thinking of the brain as our control center. So our body recognizes, oh, our body's starting to get too hot, sends a signal to the brain, and then the brain sends a signal back to our body, telling us what to do. So let's keep with this idea of temperature imbalance. So our body starts to heat up. So we send a signal, our body recognizes that, so we have the heat sensors in our skin, recognize we're starting to get too warm, sends a signal to the brain. At that point, the brain sends a signal back to our body and says, okay, we're starting to get too hot, let's take care of this. And so what does our body do? We start to sweat. And as we start to sweat, that's going to bring us back into homeostasis, back into balance, and then this system will shut off. So we call this a feedback mechanism. This diagram I showed you here, this type of feedback in particular is going to be called negative feedback. And most mechanisms in our body that are trying to help us maintain homeostasis are going to be negative feedback. Notice here in negative feedback we have the imbalance, we have this system that goes to put us back in balance. Once we're into balance, that system shuts back off. So think about negative feedback like the thermostat in your house. So you set the thermostat to a certain temperature that you want to maintain in your house. That's like homeostasis. As it starts to get too cold in your house, that sends the thermostat recognizes that, and it flips on the heater, brings the room back up to the temperature that you set, and then once you reach that temperature it turns off. If your house starts to get too hot, same thing happens, sends a signal. Now your air conditioner comes on and cools off your house till it gets back to that base temperature, back to homeostasis, then turns off. Notice the same thing is happening here. Our body works very similarly in that way. There's also something called positive feedback, which works a little bit differently. In positive feedback, what's happening, instead of shutting off the stimulus once you reach homeostasis again, in positive feedback, you're increasing that original stimulus. It keeps going and going, it keeps growing and growing as the stimulus continues. Obviously, this doesn't happen very often in the body because you can see it can be quite dangerous, because instead of shutting off, this stimulus is increasing and increasing and increasing over time. There are a few examples of this happening though. Some of the major examples are listed here. One is blood clotting, and the other is the birth of a baby. So in the birth of a baby, in the female, this is specifically with the uterine contractions. As the uterus starts to contract, that sends a signal to the brain, which then sends a signal that says keep contracting. So the more the uterus contracts, the more it's going to contract, and this just keeps building and building until the baby is born, and then that is able to shut off this stimulus here. But it keeps building and building. It doesn't shut off like the negative feedback system. That's an overview of homeostasis and how our body is able to maintain homeostasis. In the next section, we're going to look at an overview of each of the systems in the body and then talk about the language of anatomy, the different parts of the body.